Let's continue to discuss buy, borrow, die, and buy and box. So both of these strategies will borrow against your stock portfolio. And there are some common concerns or questions, and let's look at them. The first is, why do I want to borrow money? For example, I'm working now and I have a salary. Then why should I borrow money? And also, when I borrow money, isn't that risky? Because if stock drops too much, my stock will be forced liquidated. So another question is, some time ago, I suggested that when you borrow against your stock portfolio, you should only borrow a little bit, like 15%. This reduces your risk. But if I only borrow that much, how do I spend all my money, 100% of my money? So these two questions. Let's look at them one by one. First question is, when do I borrow money? Why should I borrow money? And there are two parts of this question. One is before you retire. The other is after you retire. So before you retire, for me, when I borrow money, that's when I have a one-time large expense. For example, I need to pay college tuition for my kid. I need to buy a rental property or buy a new car and so on. Because if I don't borrow money, I don't have enough cash on hand. All my cash have been invested in stock index. So I need to borrow money to pay for this cost. And then I can pay back my debt gradually. So that avoided me to sell my stock index, which can generate lots of tax. So now I'll give you one example where I borrowed money. I want to buy a rental house in the Research Triangle Park, and it cost about 600K. And in January of 2022, we signed the agreement to buy it, but it's still a new house. It's still being built. So we paid the deposit, we signed the contract, but we don't need to pay the rest of the money. Finally, in August, we need to pay the full amount. So we still have 100K cash from the refinance of another rental property. And after that, we borrow the money from interactive brokers against our stocks. So we borrowed about 500K, and the interest between 3% to 5%. So it keeps changing. At that time, we didn't know about the box spread yet. But later on, we learned the box spread and replaced most of those loans with box. And interest rate continues to rise. And at that time, box got a lower interest rate compared to the margin interest charged by interactive brokers. And gradually, I slowly paid back some of these loans to reduce the leverage. So this is one example. I actually borrowed money against the stock. And before you retire, that's one way I think we can borrow money. And after I retire, I would borrow if my other income and the dividend is not enough. Because if I don't borrow, I would have to sell stock and pay capital gain tax. And also, after I retire, if I have another one-time large expense, I would also borrow and then pay back gradually by selling some stocks tax-free using the box method. Okay, another question that's common to the borrow method is, how do we spend all my money? Because when you borrow, you can only borrow a little bit. What about the rest of the money? It's my money, I want to spend it. So my answer to this is, well, your stock portfolio is your retirement money. So you should spend it slowly and let it last long enough so that no matter how long you live, you still have enough money to enjoy your life. And there are two basic methods to do that. The first one is you withdraw some kind of a fixed amount, and every year you increase it roughly with the inflation rate. So this amount better be enough to make a living for you. And the next method is, given your stock portfolio, you always withdraw a fixed proportion. If the stock drops, you withdraw a little bit less. If the stock increases, you withdraw more. So it's always a fixed proportion. So both methods work. And when you use either method, you should first use your dividend. And if your dividend is more than the amount you withdraw, you can reinvest the rest of the dividend. But remember, you need to keep some for tax, because with dividend, you have to pay the dividend tax, which is very high. And if dividend is not enough, then you have three methods. The most basic one, that you don't borrow money. The conventional method is to sell. You sell some stocks, you pay capital gain tax. And I don't recommend this method because you wasted money on the tax. And the second method is you borrow. You borrow with stock-backed loan, and you pay the interest on the loan. You never sell, so that's called buy, borrow, die. And the last method is what I recommend. It's called box. So you still borrow, but you borrow with box. And when you do that, the interest of the money you borrowed is actually capital loss. So now you have some capital loss. You can sell some stocks to offset this capital loss. And the stocks you sell now is actually tax-free. So this allows you to gradually reduce your leverage, which is a good thing. Now let's look at the dividend of a stock index S&P 500. And the picture on the right is the historical dividend or yield from 1871 to 2021. And you look at the thick blue line. So that's the dividend. It goes up and down. Remember, dividend always have a very high tax. You cannot avoid it. And look at the history. The dividend yield is almost always higher than 2%. So in the last some years, it's not, but it's not too far from 2%. And look at this spike. So this spike happens in the Great Depression after the stock tanked about 90% from 1929, and the stock tank, the yield goes up very, very high. So that means the amount of dividend you get from your stock doesn't decrease that much, although the stock itself decreased a lot. So that's a very good thing. And in many cases, dividend increase when stock drops, because many companies, they try to give shareholders same amount of dividend, or try to keep the dividend relatively stable, even when the stocks drop. So that means depend on your dividend is more reliable than the stock price itself.